She said it the way people said things they believed no one important would hear. Not loudly, the specific low register of someone who had made an assessment and was sharing it with a colleague rather than making an announcement. The voice you used when you were talking about the room rather than to the room. She had walked into the conference room at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, and she had found my son sitting at the long table with his backpack on the chair beside him and the calculation printout in front of him, and she had said to Sandra Kern, who was 3 steps behind her, "Is the janitor's kid in here?" She had not said it to Leo. Leo had heard it. I know he heard it because I know my son. I know the specific quality of his stillness when he has received information and is deciding what to do with it, and from the drawing room where I was standing with Brandon Weil going through the 6th floor framing drawings, I could see him through the glass, and I could see the stillness arrive in him, and I could see him look at the calculation printout, and then I could see him very deliberately not look at Victoria Lorne. I did not hear what she said. I could see through the glass that something had been said, and that Leo had heard it, and that it had registered, and that Leo had chosen not to respond to it. He looked at the printout. He looked at it for 4 minutes. And then he said, in the specific, quiet voice of someone who has found something they were not looking for, "The units are wrong." Victoria Lorne stopped moving. She said, "Excuse me?" Leo said, "In the dead load calculation, Section 4.2, the mechanical equipment weight, you converted from metric tons to pounds, but everything else in the calculation is in kips. 1 metric ton is 2.2 kips, not 2,204 pounds. The mechanical load is showing as 1,000 times larger than it actually is. That's your discrepancy." Brandon Weil's hand came off the drawing set. He walked to the conference room door. He looked at the printout. He looked at Section 4.2. He put both hands on the table. He said, "6 weeks." Leo said, "I'm sorry, I was just reading what was on the table." Brandon said, "Don't apologize." He sat down. The conference room of Lorne Development Group was quiet in the specific way of a room where something significant had just been located after a long search, the quality of a space in which the pressure of weeks of looking had suddenly resolved into the specific relief of finding. Victoria Lorne looked at my son. She said, "Who are you?" He said, "Leo Ashe. I'm waiting for my dad. He's in the drawing room." She looked at me through the glass. I'd come to the door. I looked at Leo. I looked at the printout. I looked at Brandon with his hands on the table. I said, "Show me." I want to tell you about the calculation before I tell you about Leo because the calculation is the thing that the story turns on, and because you need to understand what 6 weeks of looking means before you can understand what 4 minutes of reading means. The Meridian Tower was a 42-story mixed-use commercial building proposed for downtown Indianapolis, one of the largest projects in Lorne Development Group's history, $340 million in investment, the building that would be one of the tallest in Indianapolis when it was completed, the building that Victoria Lorne had staked her company's next decade on delivering. I had been brought in as an independent peer reviewer in August 2024. My job was to look at what Brandon Weil's structural engineering team had produced and find what they had missed. Not because Brandon's team was incompetent, they were not. They were 4 Harvard and MIT-trained engineers with combined experience of 60 years in commercial structural engineering. But because the specific discipline of peer review existed precisely because the people who had built something were the least equipped to find what was wrong with it, for the specific reason that they knew too well what they had intended and tended to see the intention rather than the reality. The problem was in the transfer beam system. The Meridian Tower had a significant footprint offset between the lower 8 floors, the wide base that housed retail, parking, and the mechanical level, and the upper 34 floors of the tower itself. This offset meant that the columns supporting the tower did not sit directly above the columns supporting the base. 2. Redirect the structural load from the tower columns down to the base columns, the engineering team had designed a system of large transfer beams at the 8th floor mechanical level. Transfer beams were not unusual in tall buildings. They were, however, significant structural elements, the beams that literally transferred the weight of everything above them to the supports below, and the calculation of the loads they needed to carry was critical. Brandon Weil's team had been working on the load distribution calculation for 14 months. 6 weeks before I arrived, they had identified a discrepancy. The hand calculation of the load and the computer model's output did not agree. In structural engineering, when your hand calculation and your computer model gave different answers, one of them was wrong. The question was, which one? Brandon's team had been stuck for those 6 weeks before I was brought in. I had been looking for 2 months since. 3.5 months total, and the project had not moved. It was a unit conversion error. The specific error was this. The calculation was performed in kips, kilopound force, the unit that American structural engineers used for large loads, equal to 1,000 pounds of force. At one point in the calculation, in section 4.2, the dead load calculation for the 8th floor mechanical equipment, the engineer who had done that section had needed to convert the weight of the mechanical equipment from metric tons to the calculations units. 1 metric ton equals 2,204.6 pounds. 1 metric ton also equals 2.2046 kips. The engineer had converted correctly from metric tons to pounds. The error was that the calculation expected a value in kips, not pounds. The mechanical equipment weight had been entered as 2,204 when it should have been entered as 2.2. This made the mechanical equipment load appear to be 1,000 times heavier than it actually was. This error had then propagated through every subsequent calculation that used the dead load value, which was most of them, producing the consistent discrepancy that had stumped the team for 6 weeks and then me for 2 months. The error was, in retrospect, obvious. It was obvious in the way that errors were always obvious in retrospect, with the specific clarity of something that had been invisible while you were looking for it, and that became immediately apparent the moment someone looked at it fresh. The person who looked at it fresh was 12 years old. Naomi had died in March 2020. She had been 38 years old, and she had been a high school biology teacher at Broad Ripple High School, and she had been the most careful observer of the world that I had ever known. Not careful in the sense of cautious, careful in the sense of someone who gave things their complete attention and who did not overlay what they expected to find on top of what was actually there. This quality had made her an exceptional teacher. She had a specific practice with her biology students that she had described to me once at dinner. She would put an organism under the microscope and ask the student to describe what they saw, and she would tell the student nothing about what the organism was before they described it, because she had discovered over years of teaching that the label was the enemy of the observation. If you told the student it was a paramecium before they looked, they saw a paramecium. They saw what the label told them to see. If you let them look first, they saw what was actually there. She had brought this practice to everything. She had brought it to me, over 9 years of marriage, in the specific way that the best people brought their best qualities to the people they loved. Not by instruction, but by example. By being consistently what they were until the being became part of the shared atmosphere of the household. Leo had gotten it from her. He had been 7 years old when she died. Naomi had been at school, a March morning, 3rd period, her 10th grade biology class. She had felt suddenly unwell. She had sat down at her desk. A student had called the nurse. The school had called 911. The condition was Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome, a cardiac conduction disorder in which an abnormal electrical pathway in the heart caused episodes of very rapid heart rate. In most cases, it was manageable. In Naomi's case, the episode that morning had been severe enough to cause ventricular fibrillation. She had been resuscitated by the paramedics and had been in the hospital for 4 days and had not come home. She had not known she had it. There had been no prior episodes significant enough to investigate. It had been there, in the specific electrical architecture of her heart, since she was born. Leo had been 7. I had kept working. I had been Ash Structural Consulting's entire workforce. Daniel Ash, the calculations, the site visits, the drawings, and keeping working had been the specific form of presence that I had available to give in the year after Naomi died, the form that Leo had needed from his father. My mother, Helen, had been essential in the way that certain grandmothers became essential. The daily morning drop-off and the after-school pickup and the dinners and the homework and the specific unconditional presence of someone who had decided that what the household needed was more important than what she had planned. Leo had grown up between Helen's kitchen and my drawing board and the project sites I took him to on school holidays. the specific education of a child who had spent significant time around adult work and adult thinking, and who had been treated, always, as someone whose observations were worth hearing. He had found my copy of Hibbler's Structural Analysis on the bookshelf when he was 10. He had asked what it was. I had said it was a textbook for structural engineers, probably too advanced for him. He had said probably and taken it to his room. He had come back 3 weeks later with 9 questions written in his notebook. The questions had been specific, correctly framed using the book's terminology, and in 2 cases had pointed at something I had not thought about in precisely that way. I had sat at the kitchen table with him for 2 hours. He had been 10 years old. He had been reading structural engineering materials since. Not exclusively, he also read history and the specific long biographies of scientists and engineers that the Broad Ripple branch of the Indianapolis Public Library stocked with the specific intention of a library that understood its neighborhood. But structural engineering was the organizing interest, the discipline that his mind returned to when other things were done. His shoes were worn because the decision between new shoes and 3 more books was not, for Leo, a difficult decision. His clothes were functional for the same reason. He had been sitting in the Lorne Development Group conference room for 40 minutes because Helen had a doctor's appointment, and because Leo had a school holiday, and because I had needed to be at the office for the drawing review, and because I had told Leo he could sit in the conference room while I worked and that there were drawings and papers on the table that he could look at if he wanted. He had looked. He had found it in 40 minutes. I want to tell you what happened in the conference room after Brandon said 6 weeks and sat down, because the room had several things in it at once, and they all mattered. There was Brandon Weil, 44 years old, Harvard Civil Engineering, 15 years in commercial structural practice, a genuinely good engineer who had been staring at this problem for 6 weeks and who now understood that a 12-year-old had found in 40 minutes what his team had not found in 6 weeks, and who was handling this with the specific grace of someone who had decided that what mattered was not the finding, but the found. There was Sandra Kern, who had said nothing when Victoria made the comment, who was now standing at the edge of the room with the specific quality of someone who had witnessed 2 things in the past 4 minutes that she would be thinking about for a long time. There was Victoria Lorne, who had said what she had said and who was now in the specific position of someone who needed to address what they had said. And there was Leo, who had said what he had said and who was now looking at the calculation printout with the specific focused quality of someone who had found something and who was checking to make sure he had found it correctly. Victoria sat down at the table. She said, "Leo." Leo looked at her. She said, "I said something when I came in. You heard it." Leo said, "Yes." She said, "It was wrong. I'm sorry." Leo said, "Okay." She said, "That's it? Okay?" Leo said, "You apologized. Accepted. What else do you need?" Victoria looked at me. I did not say anything. She said to Leo, "How long have you been reading structural calculations?" Leo said, 2 years, since I was 10. She said, "Where do you go to school?" He said, "Broad Ripple Middle School." She said, "And you found in 40 minutes what a team of Harvard and MIT structural engineers couldn't find in 6 weeks. Leo said, "I didn't know they hadn't found it. I was just reading what was on the table." Victoria looked at Brandon. Brandon said, "That's why he found it." Leo said, "The error isn't complicated. It's a unit conversion mistake. They teach it in the first week of any engineering program." Brandon said, "We checked every input 3 times. Leo said, "You checked the right inputs, but you checked them for the right error. You were looking for something complicated because the discrepancy was large, and large discrepancies usually come from complicated errors. Nobody was looking for something simple." Brandon looked at me. I said, "He's right." Brandon said, "I know." Victoria said, "How much would I need to pay a structural engineer for 40 minutes of work?" I said, "Nothing. He's 12 years old. He's not a structural engineer." She said, "He found it." I said, "He found it." She said, "Then he's more useful than my structural engineers." Brandon said, "Today he is." Leo said, "It's one calculation section. The rest of the work is correct." Brandon looked at Leo with the specific expression of a man who was recalibrating something. He said, "You've read the rest of it?" Leo said, I've been here for 40 minutes. Brandon said, All of it? Leo said, Most of it. The transfer beam sizing is conservative but correct. The connection details at the column interfaces are good. The shear wall layout is... There's a question in section 7.4 about the distribution of lateral forces, but I didn't have time to work it through. The conference room was the specific quality of a room in which the expected shape of the afternoon had been entirely replaced by a different shape. Brandon said to me, Can he come back? I looked at my son. Leo said, What's section 7.4? The drive home took 35 minutes through the Indianapolis October afternoon. The specific quality of a Midwestern October that was honest about what it was, which was the beginning of the end of warmth, the season that announced itself without apology. Leo was in the passenger seat with his notebook open, writing something. He had been writing since we left the parking structure. He was working through something in the notation he had developed for himself, not the standard structural engineering notation, his own system, the specific private language of a mind that had been teaching itself. I said, Leo. He said, Yeah. I said, I need to tell you something about what happened in there, before you found the error. He said, She said the janitor's kid. I said, You heard it. He said, Yes. I said, I didn't. I was in the drawing room. I saw that something happened, but I didn't hear what she said. He said, I know. I said, Are you? He said, I'm okay. I said, Leo. He said, Dad. She apologized. She meant it. I could tell. I said, How? He said, She sat down. She looked at me. She didn't explain or justify. She just said it was wrong and she was sorry. That's what it looks like when someone means it. I thought about this. I said, You've thought about what apologies look like. He said, Grandma says you can tell by whether the person makes it about themselves or about you. If they make it about themselves, it's not really an apology. If they make it about you, it is. I said, She sat down and made it about you. He said, Yes. I said, I was going to say something when I came in. I saw her say something to Sandra, and I saw you hear it, and I was going to come in and... He said, It was fine. I was about to find the error anyway. I said, That's not why it was fine. He said, I know, but it is fine. People make assumptions. She assumed. Then she saw she was wrong and she said so. That's actually how it's supposed to work. I looked at the road. He said, Dad. I said, Yeah. He said, The error. Why do you think they didn't find it? I said, Because they'd been looking for too long. They had ideas about where it was. They were looking for something complicated because the discrepancy was large, and large discrepancies usually come from complicated errors. You didn't have any assumptions about what size the error should be. You just read it. He said, Because they knew too much. I said, Yes. He was quiet for a moment. He said, Grandpa used to say that. I said, Your great-grandfather? He said, The bricklayer. I said, My father, yes. He said, He used to say the man who'd been laying brick for 30 years was sometimes the wrong person to find what was wrong, because he was too sure he was doing it right. He'd say sometimes you needed someone who'd never laid a brick to come look. I said, Where did you hear that? He said, You told me, when I was 9. You were telling me about why you did peer review. I said that when you were 9. He said, You said a lot of things when I was 9. I wrote them down. I looked at my son. He was 12 years old and he had his mother's quality of attending to things without the overlay of what he expected to find, and my father's understanding of what it meant to look at work with fresh eyes, and his own specific additional quality, which was the ability to sit in a room with a calculation that had stumped 4 credentialed engineers for 6 weeks, and to read it the way you read a thing when you did not know it was supposed to be hard. I thought about my father and the bricks and what he had understood about looking, and I thought about Naomi and the microscope and the label that was the enemy of the observation, and I thought about Leo at 12 years old with his notebook in the conference room, not knowing that he was supposed to find it hard. He had just read what was on the table. I thought about Naomi. I thought about her biology class, the specific practice, the organism under the microscope, the label as the enemy of the observation. I had thought about this practice many times over the 4 years since she died, not as a memorial to her, but as the thing I returned to when I needed to understand something about how I was looking at what I was looking at. Leo had gotten it from her. He had been 7 when she died. He had been 7, and he had absorbed things from her that I could identify now, but that he did not remember consciously learning. Not lessons. The specific way she had of being in the world, the complete willingness to see what was there rather than what you expected. He had carried that into the Lorne Development Group conference room on a Tuesday afternoon in October and had applied it to a calculation printout that 4 engineers with combined credentials worth more than my annual income had not been able to resolve. He had not done it to prove anything. He had done it because the printout was on the table and he was reading what was in front of him. I said, "Leo." He said, "Yeah." I said, "Your mother would have. She would have found that extremely satisfying." He said, "Finding the error?" I said, "The whole afternoon." He thought about this. He said, "Because of the thing with the label." I said, "What?" He said, "She used to say you couldn't see what was really there if you already knew what you were supposed to see. Brandon's team knew they were supposed to see a complicated error, so they saw complicated things. I didn't know what I was supposed to see, so I saw what was there." I said, "You remember her saying that?" He said, "I remember a lot of things." He went back to his notebook. I drove through the October afternoon with my son writing his private notation in the passenger seat and Naomi in the specific place she lived in my understanding of things, which was everywhere that clarity lived, in the finding of what was actually there, in the looking without the overlay, in the complete willingness to be wrong about what you expected. Victoria Lorne called on Thursday. I was at my drawing board going through the corrected calculation, the one that Brandon's team had updated with the correct unit conversion, the one that now produced numbers that matched the computer model, the one that would allow the Meridian Tower project to move forward after 3.5 months of standing still. She said, "I want to talk about Leo." I said, "All right," she said. "Not as a curiosity. I want to offer him an internship. A real one. Saturdays working with Brandon's team on the Meridian Tower drawings. Not fetching coffee, looking at drawings, asking questions, doing what he did Tuesday." I said, "I'll ask him." She said, "There's something else I want to say?" I said, "All right." She said, "The comment I made when I came in on Tuesday. I want you to understand what it was and what it wasn't." I said, "You don't need to explain it to me." She said, "I know I don't. I want to." She paused. She said, "I have $340 million on the line. I have a construction schedule that was 3.5 months behind. I walked into a room where my answer was supposed to be, and instead there was a kid in worn shoes reading papers that weren't his, and I said something that I would not have said if I had been in a better moment. That is not an excuse. It's a context." I said, "I understand the difference." She said, "What I said was wrong regardless of the context. I know that. The context is just why it happened, not whether it should have." I said, "Leo understood that too. He told me she apologized and she sat down and made it about him and not about herself, and that's how you could tell she meant it." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "He's 12. I said, "Yes." She said, "How did you raise him to be that?" I said, "His mother built most of what he is. I've just been maintaining it." She said, "What happened to his mother?" I said, "She died in 2020. A cardiac condition she didn't know she had." She said, "He was 7. I said, "Yes." She said, "And he read your engineering textbooks." I said, "He read everything. Engineering is the thing he keeps coming back to." She said, "He's going to be extraordinary." I said, "He already is." She said, "Yes, I know that now." She paused. She said, "I'd like to tell him that myself, when I see him on Saturday." I said, "He'll appreciate it. He'll also want to look at Section 7.4. She said, "What's in Section 7.4? I said, "He had a question about the lateral force distribution in the shear walls. He didn't have time to work it through on Tuesday." She said, "Is there an error?" I said, "I don't know yet. Neither does he. But when Leo Ash has a question about a calculation section, I've learned to take it seriously." She said, "So have I." Leo came back on Saturday. He came with his notebook and his backpack and his worn shoes and the specific quality of someone who was entering a space where serious work happened and who understood this and who was ready for it. Brandon Weil met him at the elevator. Brandon said, "Section 7.4. Leo said, "Section 7.4. They went to the drawing room. I stood at the window of the drawing room and watched my son sit across from a Harvard-educated structural engineer, and I thought about my father and what he had understood about looking at things with fresh eyes, and I thought about Naomi and the label that was the enemy of the observation, and I thought about Leo at 12 years old with his notebook not knowing that he was supposed to find it hard. He had just read what was on the table. Brandon laid out the Section 7.4 drawings. Leo opened his notebook. He said, "Walk me through the lateral force path from the roof to the foundations." Brandon walked him through it. Leo listened with the complete quality of listening that was Naomi's, the absence of anticipation, the receiving rather than the expecting. He asked 2 questions. Brandon answered both. Leo wrote something in his notebook. He said, "The distribution assumes symmetrical wind loading on all 4 elevations, but the tower has a setback on the north elevation at the 28th floor. The setback changes the wind pressure profile on that face. Has the model accounted for the asymmetrical loading?" Brandon stopped. He looked at the drawing. He looked at Leo. He said slowly, "No, it hasn't." Leo said, "I thought that might be it." Brandon said, "Is it a significant error?" Leo said, "I don't know. You'd need to run it. It might be within the safety margins. It might not be." Brandon said, "It might not be." Leo said, "Yes." Brandon looked at the drawing for a long moment. He said, "Leo." Leo said, "Yeah." Brandon said, "I want you to understand something. What you found on Tuesday, the unit conversion, was the kind of error that happens and that peer review catches. That's what peer review is for. But what you just found, the asymmetrical wind loading, that's not a calculation error. That's a modeling assumption that needed to be questioned. We would have caught the unit conversion eventually. I'm not certain we would have caught this." Leo said, "Because you assumed the model was right." Brandon said, "Because we built the model." "Yes." Leo said, "Mom used to say you can't see what's really there if you already know what you're supposed to see." Brandon said, "Your mom sounds like she was a remarkable person." Leo said, "She was a biology teacher. She used to make students look at things before she told them what the things were." Brandon said, "That's structural engineering." Leo said, "That's everything." I drove Leo home at 4 p.m. He had his notebook open and was going through what he had written during the drawing review with the specific focused quality of someone who was processing what they had found and deciding what it meant. After a while, he said, "Dad." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Do you think Mom would have been a good structural engineer?" I thought about Naomi, about the microscope and the label, about the complete willingness to see what was actually there. I said, "She would have been good at anything that required looking clearly." He said, "That's structural engineering." I said, "Yes." He said, "That's everything." He went back to his notebook. I drove through the Indianapolis October afternoon, the specific quality of a Midwestern Saturday at 4 p.m. in October, when the light had the particular slanted quality of a season that was leaving, and that was beautiful in the leaving, in the way that things were sometimes beautiful precisely because they were leaving. I thought about what Brandon had said. We would have caught the unit conversion eventually. I'm not certain we would have caught this. Leo had found both of them, not because he was a prodigy in the dramatic sense, not because he had abilities that were categorically different from other people's, because he had learned from Naomi, without knowing he was learning it, to look at what was actually there, because he had learned from my father, through me, that the person who had never done the thing was sometimes the right person to find what was wrong with the thing, because he had been 12 years old in a conference room with a calculation printout and no assumptions about what he was supposed to find, and he had simply read what was on the table. That was all. That was, as it turned out, enough. I said, "Leo." He said, "Yeah." I said, "Your mother would be proud of you." He said, "I know." He said it without performance, without false modesty, with the specific matter-of-fact quality of someone who knew what was true and did not need to inflate or deflect it. He went back to his notebook. The city went by. The October afternoon did what October afternoons did. I drove. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Is there something you've been looking at for so long that you can no longer see it clearly? A problem, a relationship, a situation, something where the looking itself has become the obstacle? Sometimes the person who has never seen the thing is the only one who can tell you what the thing actually is. Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you today, share it with one person who needs to hear it. You already know who that is. And if you're new here, subscribe. Every week, a story like this one. Real people, real decisions, the kind that stay with you.